All right, good morning, ladies and gentlemen. Let's get started. So first of all, let's talk about the test. You should all have had your tests returned to you through email by now, and the answer key is posted on the CourseLink website. The test was done well, I thought. I think class average was 77, 78, so folks did real well. If you want your tests regraded, that's something that I do. So TAs mark the tests, but I do regrading. So there's a second pair of eyes to take a look at any issues that you might have. But note that there's already been one grade added to everybody's test to take into account any marking errors. Humans mark these things. They mark a lot of them. So there will be the possible half mark missed here or there. And so a grade has been awarded to everybody to take into account that potential grading error. So contact me if you want something regraded if there's an error over 1, okay? Because an error of 1 has already been taken into account. Okay, so if there is an error of over 1 in terms of the grading, then please feel free to contact me. The regrading process would be such that you would email me and then lay out in the email what you think you deserved marks for in comparison to the marking scheme, and then I'll take a look at it. Okay, so pretty simple. I will only take a look at the thing that you asked me to take a look at. It doesn't involve an entire regrading. There's no fear-mongering here. We just want to make sure that you get the right grade associated with what you put on the paper. That's all. Right? Are there anybody have any questions about regrading or the test itself or? Everybody good? Yeah? Okay, so then let's dive right back into the material. We were focusing on Thursday on fluid flux at the level of the kidney, and we had talked about the vasculature, how we get things from the vasculature and back to the vasculature, because we're really good at the vasculature by now in terms of fluid flux. And then we need to pay some special attention to the nephron itself, to understand a little bit more about that, because we're not as savvy with the nephron yet, not as savvy as we are with the vasculature. So what we had talked about was how at the level of the glomerulus or the capillary bed in the kidney, how we would get fluid flux from the glomerulus into the Bowman's capsule. So we looked at delta P and delta pi in terms of creating fluid flux across this entire capillary bed. And then we talked about if we had stuff in the interstitial space in the kidney, what delta P and delta pi would be to move it back into the vascular space, so basically filtration in one area and reabsorption in another. And then what we hadn't yet talked about was how we actually get, once we move filtrate into the kidney, into the nephron, into this tube, how do we get it from here into that interstitial space? Because we know once we get it from the tubule into the interstitial space, we know then, because of delta P and delta pi, we can reabsorb that back into the bloodstream. Okay, so the game afoot now with the kidney and with every nephron is to, once stuff is filtered, we now want to take back the things that we want, put it in the interstitial space. Once it's there, we know we can get it back into the peritubular capillary bed. Okay? So again, the philosophy of that kidney was to filter all kinds of products and only take back what we want. So the wall of this nephron then is going to have very special characteristics in order to get back the things we want. And we started to see that with the proximal tubule. We went over this as well. We looked at the proximal tubule. in that lumen of that tubule, we found our filtrate out here, and then we have a cell layer and our interstitial space. So here we are starting to talk about how we are moving things that we want from the filtrate, from the lumen of the tubule into that interstitial space. And we saw that we had basically a set of asymmetrical cells that were built with transporters on one side, transporters on the other, to be able to move products from the lumen of the tubule through the cell into that interstitial space. Okay, so we had a lot of symporters built on the tubule side and facilitated transport on the interstitial space side to be able to move things like glucose and amino acid, phosphate, lactate, bicarb, so all the things that we want. Okay, so this is us getting back the things that we want, putting them in interstitial space, and then we already know once we can get it there, we can get it right back into the peritubular capillary bed based on delta P and delta pi. We moved ions, we moved water moved to dilute, so this process ends up concentrating the interstitial space a fair amount, so water will move to dilute that, so water moves by osmosis. We also had some water channels that we were going to be able to move water through. Okay, then we did put some placeholders for some other, for hydrogen ion and CO2, or hydrogen ion and bicarb, and we will plant these ideas here and then come back to them when we deal with acid-base regulation. And then we also saw that at the proximal tubule, we could also secrete products. Right, so we could have things in the peritubular capillary. If we could move them to the interstitial space, like large categories, organic cations and anions, then we could move them into the cell and then into the lumen of the tubule. So we have stuff moving in both ways. Right, so we could secrete if we could get out to here, and then ultimately we could excrete. Right, so this process would be called secretion. We can get it into the tubule. If we can get it back somewhere, we will have reabsorbed it. If we can't get it back anywhere, it will be excreted. Okay, so secretion can lead to excretion. So the thing about the proximal tubule is that it's set up with all of these transporters, and then when filtrate flows by, we will remove from that filtrate. This is called, and the removal is called obligatory. It's just going to happen. Okay, we don't have a lot of control over this. We are just going to take out the things that we want based on those transporters. So the removal here is often called obligatory. Okay, it's just going to move. Interesting thing, though, is for the bulk of the things we want, like glucose, lactate, amino acids, phosphate, this is the only place for their removal. Okay, the rest of the tubule has no transporters for these types of products. So the proximal tubule is the only place for reabsorption of these types of things that we want. So for example, if glucose gets filtered and we reabsorb it, life is good. Glucose, we worked a lot to get that glucose into the system, right? It took a lot of energy to bring glucose in, and glucose is a high energy store, so we want to keep it. So we have all kinds of transporters to get that glucose that we filtered back, okay? But because there is a set number of these transporters, there is a transport maximum, so we can actually exceed that. So if we filter huge amounts of glucose, let's say in an uncontrolled diabetic state, filter huge amounts of glucose that exceed our transport maximum, and glucose gets out of the proximal tubule, there is no other place to bring it back. So it's as good as gone. Okay, the same thing happens for filtered phosphates and amino acids. They are as good as gone if we get them out of the proximal tubule. Okay, so this is pretty catastrophic. We don't want to excrete things that we want. Okay, Again, it took a lot of work. Think about how much work it took for your body to convince you to bring glucose in, okay? In terms of eating and digesting and all that kind of stuff to bring glucose in, the last thing we want is to just excrete it out, okay? So we have a huge capacity to reabsorb glucose, right? But you can get situations like, as in uncontrolled diabetics, where their blood glucose is so high, their filtered glucose is so high that glucose gets out of the proximal tubule and then shows up in the urine. Okay, so classic test for uncontrolled diabetes is to check for glucose in the urine, because you're getting it through the proximal tubule and it's being excreted. It's highly unusual, and you're in a disease state when that happens. Okay? So we will see a little bit how this proximal tubule might be controlled, but essentially what we have, the transporters that we have in this section are going to be getting back what we want. Problem is, no other places along the tubule can do that. Now, other places along the tubule are going to be dealing with bicarbon hydrogen ion, and we're going to be seeing cells that deal with sodium and chloride and potassium. Okay, we deal with those in other places, but not these not these top four, anyways. Okay, so that was from Thursday. So let's talk a little bit before we leave the proximal tubule about how we might regulate the reabsorption. We did talk about that it was going to be obligatory. We were just going to reabsorb if we could get filtrate by the proximal tubule and by all those transporters. Okay? But there's a little bit of regulation. Part of that regulation comes through autoregulation, so that myogenic response again. Okay, so this is a couple times we've talked about it now. This stretch causing constriction, all right, in order to maintain flow constant over a range of pressures, right? So the kidney is doing this as well. Afferent and efferent arterioles are doing this. Okay, if afferent and our efferent arterioles are doing this, you remember when we constrict one over the other, we will change our filtration rate. But when we constrict both at the same time, you get no change in filtration rate. Okay? So the myogenic response occurs in both afferent and efferent at the same time. So the result will be that we will have no change in filtration rate over a range of pressures. Okay, so that autoregulation is helping us maintain filtration rate at a constant. Okay, and here's why. Because there is a possible problem. With our filtration rate and the proximal tubule. Okay? So if we were to be in a situation where we increase glomerular filtration rate, so we're increasing GFR, this would increase volume in the tubule and increase flow in the tubule. Okay? The proximal tubule. If I increase flow in the proximal tubule, then I'm going to decrease the time that volume has to spend in the proximal tubule, right? Flow, that volume of fluid that we just flowed in there will be moving much faster through that proximal tubule than it would have been previously. The problem with moving more quickly is we decrease equilibration time. Okay, so when we move fluid through the tubule, it's all about equilibration time. How much time do we let that fluid sit by those transporters? If we don't let that fluid sit by those transporters for very long, then we can't transport the stuff out. Okay, so an increase in flow in the proximal tubule means a decrease in equilibration time. Okay, therefore, the amount that the potential to remove stuff at the proximal tubule drops. Okay, and again, if we can't remove it at the proximal tubule and it gets out, it's as good as excreted. Okay, so we don't want to be losing, let's say, glucose, for an example, from the kidney just because GFR changed a little bit. And it's possible to get GFR changing just by, if we had pressure changes, just by standing up and sitting down during a day. Okay, so this is tightly controlled to help us with this potential problem. So let's write that out. If I increase GFR, I increase flow in the tubule. This means a decrease in equilibration time. So this essentially decreases our time to remove those solutes in the proximal tubule. So if we can't reabsorb it at the level of the proximal tubule, then it's as good as gone. So we have the potential to lose solutes through excretion. So it's all about hang time when it comes to flow through the tubule. Okay? You have to have that volume, spend a little bit of time by those transporters. The higher the flow rate we have, the less time we have to spend. So this is why the system is set up, or this is why this really helps us, right? So that when you get a sudden change in pressure, like going from sitting to standing, you get the sudden change in pressure at the level of the kidneys. Both afferent and afferent arterioles experience that stretch and they quickly constrict. Okay? They felt an increase in stretch, quickly constrict, decrease their radius, increase resistance, drop flow. Okay? And if both afferent and efferent do it at the same time, then that's going to keep our input and our output constant and keep our GFR constant. Okay, so that myogenic response, or that autoregulation, is working to keep GFR at a constant over a range of mean arterial pressures. That's all that graph is saying. Okay? Let's write that out. So GFR is a constant. Over a range of pressures. So we're doing this by autoregulation. That was that myogenic response. And it's so important to protect glomerular filtration rate that there's a second mechanism put in here called tubuloglomerular feedback. And we won't get to explore, I'm going to plant this one here for now. We won't get to explore it until we figure out what the distal tubule is doing, because this is a way that the distal tubule is going to communicate with afferent and efferent arterioles in order to make sure GFR stays constant. Okay, so I'm going to plant this here, but we're going to come back to it probably in about 2 days. Okay, so we'll circle back here. But again, it's going to be another mechanism in order to keep GFR constant so we don't mess with our equilibration time in our proximal tubule. Okay? So a second, in terms of regulation of proximal tubule reabsorption, there's a second mechanism, glomerular tubular balance. So this is an intrinsic control. This is something the tube is just going to do all on its own, okay? And this balance is such that if we increase GFR and we increase tubular flow, we actually see an increase in the rate of reabsorption. In the proximal tubule. So if we have a certain rate of glucose transport and then suddenly GFR goes up and flow in that tube goes up, suddenly we are able to increase that transportation rate. Okay? Now the mechanism for this is absolutely unknown. Okay, you got to get to grad school and figure this one out. I've been begging people to do that for like 18 years and no one's got back to me yet, so I have high hopes that it will be you in 10 years coming back to me saying, well, Coral, this is what it does. The cool thing is it's happening right at the level of the tube itself. So you can take out that little proximal tubule, disassociate it from all nerves and hormones and all that kind of stuff, and increase flow through it, and this just happens. So it's something that's happening right at the level of that little piece of tube, and it has something to do with flow, so it probably has to do with shear, except that's a little bit weird because there's no red blood cells in this filtrate. So I have no idea what it is. Way cool that it's happening right in the level of that little tube. So go figure that one out for me. We do have direct SNS innervation into this proximal tubule, so we've got a little bit of neural control. It does look like we could increase sodium reabsorption in the tubule through this mechanism, and every time you're looking at sodium reabsorption, it's not usually because you want sodium back, it's because you want water to follow, okay? So remember, water moves by osmosis. The only way we can get water to, you can put as many aquaporins in those cells as you like. Water will not move through them unless you drive it to move through, okay? So we can make things permeable to water at the level of the kidney, but unless we set up a concentration gradient for something else and have water move to dilute, it's not gonna move, okay? So a lot of what the kidney is doing and a lot of what we will be talking about the kidney doing is when we move water, or when we move sodium, we're thinking about how that's going to affect water movement, okay? And then because obviously if we have direct SNS innervation down to these cells in the proximal tubule must have an adrenergic membrane receptor population, right? So if we're going to have direct neural control over it, then you know we're going to have hormonal control over it with epinephrine through the vasculature. So SNS stimulating the adrenal glands, releasing epi and norepi into the bloodstream, wanders around, finds the membrane receptor on the proximal tubule, is going to do exactly the same thing as our neural control did. It's the same membrane receptor population. And then we have some other hormonal control that we're not going to deal too much with, angiotensin II, adrenocorticotropic hormone, increased sodium reabsorption and therefore increased water reabsorption here. And atrial natriuretic peptide has a little bit of control. Some evidence says that it's going to act to drop sodium reabsorption and then drop water reabsorption. But at the end of the day, not hugely powerful control here. A little bit, but not massive. Okay? So we can control that little bit of the proximal tubule a little bit. All right, so the next part of the tube, let's get out of the proximal tubule. The next part of the tube is the loop of Henle. So 3 parts of the loop of Henle, differentiated by their permeability characteristics. Okay, so the thin descending limb, descending meaning now it's dropping down into that medullary space. We're talking about juxtamedullary nephrons here. The loop of Henle is dropping down from the cortex down into that medullary space. The thin descending limb, permeable to water, not permeable to sodium. And then it loops around through that medullary space and back up. The thin ascending limb, impermeable to water, permeable to sodium. And then the thick ascending limb is impermeable to water. Okay, and we will put that tube in place and see why that matters in a minute. So the thick ascending limb in particular, it is impermeable to water, but it also has these cells with these special symporters. So we have symporters in the thick ascending limb which move out potassium, chloride, and sodium. Okay? So time spent in the thick ascending limb is going to mean ions moved from the lumen of the tubule. Okay, the more time we spend there, the more ions we remove. The less time we spend, the less ions we remove. And of course, with these ions moving, water will follow. Okay? So we do, in the thick ascending limb, we do mess with these ions, and then there's going to be a little bit of water movement here. We do mess with hydrogen ion and bicarb in the thick ascending limb, but we're not going to deal with that today. We're just going to think a little harder about these symporters. And then we do have a little bit of regulation of the thick ascending limb, so the sympathetic nervous system does seem to innervate it. And we can increase sodium reabsorption a little bit, and therefore increase water reabsorption. So a little bit of control here from the sympathetic nervous system, but quite powerful hormonal control. And I mean, obviously there'll be epinephrine will be able to control in the same way the neural system did, but an added level of control or level of hormonal control is through aldosterone. Okay, so aldosterone can actually increase the number of symporters on the luminal side and the number of transporters, for instance, the sodium potassium ATPase on the interstitial space side. Okay, essentially what does this, if you follow the bouncing sodium, that essentially means we are increasing sodium reabsorption through this maneuver, which will increase water reabsorption. Okay, so this little bit of the tubule, we have some pretty powerful hormonal control, special little mechanism here. Okay, and we'll see why that matters soon, once we get all our hormones out there. And then, of course, we have epinephrine, which is going to act in the same way that the neural system did. Okay, so a little bit of control here. All right. The next, so we got ourselves through the thin descending limb, the thin ascending limb, the thick ascending limb. The next part of the tube that we have is the distal tubule. So they separate this into early and late. The early distal tubule is impermeable to water, and there is some sodium and chloride symport up there, but we're not going to deal too much with it. It's the late distal tubule and the collecting duct where a lot of the action happens. Now, there are two cell types in the late distal tubule and the collecting duct. All the other cell types that I've been dealing with, even though I had like 4 boxes in the proximal tubule, I didn't mean to imply that there were 4 cell types there. All cells in the proximal tubule can do all the transport that we talked about. Here, though, there are 2 very special cell types, principal cells and intercalated cells. The intercalated cells are one we're going to deal with when it comes to messing with acid-base regulation. Okay? So we need about a couple more weeks of lecture before we return to the late distal tubule and the collecting duct. And then critical for our discussion here today are principal cells, because they can be controlled hormonally. Okay, so we do have a little bit of movement of sodium and potassium through these principal cells, but the critical bit is their hormonal control. There is some neural control over these cells to increase sodium and therefore increase water reabsorption. So basically the entire tubule, other than the thin descending and ascending limb, looks like it's affected by the sympathetic nervous system. It looks like we increase sodium reabsorption with this. But special to the principal cells is their response to antidiuretic hormone or vasopressin. Sometimes you'll see it referred to as one or the other. It used to be vasopressin, changed its name to ADH, and now we like to call it both. So ADH vasopressin. So if we increase ADH vasopressin, we increase water channels or aquaporins on the luminal side and the interstitial space side to increase water permeability. Okay, so we have the ability with this hormone to make this section of the tubule, distal tubular collecting duct, more permeable to water, or less permeable to water if we drop ADH. Okay, so now we have control over the permeability of this part of the tube. Okay, so the opposite is true for a decrease in ADH, decrease in the water channels on both sides, and decreased permeability. Critical bit though here is we can change permeability to water, but water won't move unless we drive it. Okay, so water isn't going to just if we allow a pathway for it to go, water is not going to move all on its own. We have to have a concentration gradient to drive water to move by osmosis. Okay. We have a little bit of control with aldosterone in terms of increasing sodium reabsorption down here. And atrial natriuretic peptides, so we're starting to see the same players, excuse me, over and over and over again. And then really cool in this site, we have a new little hormone, urodilantin. It acts the same way as atrial natriuretic peptide does. Atrial natriuretic peptide is something that's going to come from the right atria based on stretch. So that atrial natriuretic peptide will circulate around the body, find the membrane receptor population down here at the distal tubular collecting duct. Urodilantin will do exactly the same thing, but it's all local. So that urodilantin is produced right at the tube and acts right at the tube. Okay? So this is really classic local and central control of water reabsorption. So it's a common theme in physiology. Often we'll see a local controller, so the tissue taking care of itself, and then a central controller, which means the body wants control over that too. Okay? So both urodilantin and atrial natriuretic peptide, they'll inhibit sodium and therefore water reabsorption. And again, this is just a little description about how urodilantin, it's local hormone. Stimulation is going to come from an increased mean arterial pressure and blood volume, so it's got to be some sort of stretch down here or flow at the level of the distal tubular collecting duct. Secreted right down here to act right down here. Okay, so a little bit of control or more control of the late distal tubular collecting duct, and critical is the role of ADH vasopressin and the ability to increase the water permeability or decrease the water permeability depending on our concentration of ADH. All right, so those are the characteristics of that tube. Now we have to put that tube back into where it lives in order to understand how any of this is working. Okay? So let's take a quick think then about what's coming out of the tube, or what's being filtered, and then what's controlling movement out of that tubule. Okay, so if we graph the relationship between the volume in the tube versus the filtered volume, so if we think about the volume in the tube versus the filtered volume, and we look at that over the length of the nephron, and we think about that that proximal tubule, get all choked up with the proximal tubule. The proximal tubule, the loop of Henle, then we head into the distal tubule and the collecting duct. Okay, so if we think of the length of the nephron, that we reabsorb. So if we filter, so the volume in the tube divided by the filtered volume, so that ratio is going to be 1 right at the Bowman's capsule, right? Because the volume in the tube is what we filtered. That across the proximal tubule, we had kind of all of that obligatory reabsorption. So we are reabsorbing now about 70% of what we filtered is happening just because we flowed it by all those transporters, okay? So then the rest of the tube now, we have 30% to deal with. How do we get back or not that 30%? So we will flux some across the loop of Henle and the distal tubule. But as we get to the late distal tubule and the collecting duct, what we move now is going to be dependent on the permeability of the distal tubule and the collecting duct, and therefore the presence of antidiuretic hormone, or ADH vasopressin, right? Because that was the biggest player down here. So if we have very little ADH, we will keep it in the tubule. The volume will stay in that tube, right? Because the distal tubule and the collecting duct are not permeable to water. So the volume in the tube is going to stay in the tube, and then it's as good as out, okay? If we do have ADH and we are permeable, then we're going to move volume from the tubule into the interstitial space. So we have the ability to shift how much we reabsorb or how much we mess with after the proximal tubule, depending on our concentration of ADH. Okay, so that's going to be pretty important. But we can't just have water move because of the presence of ADH and the increase in permeability. There's another piece that we still have to add to this. So at the end of the day, we need to think then, if this is all going to be obligatory, then that's just going to happen. 70% we're getting back. It's in the interstitial space, and we already know then how to move that from the interstitial space into the peritubular capillary bed, right? We got that nailed. It's this other 30% that are going to be dependent on other issues. So movement out of the loop of Henle, the distal tubule, and that collecting duct. Is going to be dependent on 4 things. The osmotic gradient that exists in the medulla, okay, so I'm going to explain that in a minute. But let's get down the list because we're actually going to spend the rest of our time here in the kidney working down this list. So it's dependent on the osmotic gradient that exists in the medulla. It's dependent on the presence of ADH. It's going to be dependent on the presence of atrial natriuretic peptide and the presence of another suite of hormones, the renin, angiotensin II, aldosterone system, okay? So at the end of the day, when you look at movement out of that 30% that we have to play with, movement out of the loop of Henle, distal tube, and the collecting duct is highly, highly hormonally controlled, okay? But primarily because of the osmotic gradient in the medullary space, okay? So what we're going to do is we're going to work through, we're going to be thinking about that 30% for the next little while in our discussion, and we're going to be working through control through each of these. Okay? So let's think about then the osmotic gradient that exists in the medullary space. What on earth am I talking about? All right, so we're going to spend a little time here. So what I've got here is that loop of Henle, the distal tubule, and the collecting duct. Okay, so that's this tube here, right? So this is us inside the tubule. Okay, this is our loop of Henle. This is our loop of Henle, our descending thin limb, ascending thin limb, ascending thick limb. Look what I did there, real tricky, right? Ascending thick limb. Ascending thick limb, the distal tubule, and the collecting duct. Okay, so that's just the latter piece of the tube. The proximal tubule is on here before this, but that doesn't matter because all that was just obligatory movement. Okay? And so then this loop of Henle is coming down. It's a juxtamedullary nephron. This loop of Henle is coming down into that medullary space, going back up into the cortex, and the collecting duct then is going back down into that medullary space. Okay, so what's the big deal? So the big deal is how that medullary space is built in terms of what its osmolarity is. So if we think about what the interstitial space is, or that medullary space, we have the cortex region, and its osmolarity is 300. Okay, this is osmolarity. Osmolarity is 300, and the number is milliosmoles per liter. That's what these numbers are that are on here. That the medullary space is highly concentrated, and it's concentrated the more you move down it. Okay, so that as you move from the outer medullary space to the inner medullary region, the interstitial space becomes very concentrated. Okay. So we're going to go over an example in the presence of low ADH first. So we're going to kind of turn the hormones off and just watch what's going to happen when you take a tube with the characteristics we just talked about and put it through a concentration gradient. Okay? This concentration gradient is the drive to move. Okay, so here's our drive to move water. So I've got this, concentration gradient on the outside. Now on the inside, we, just as we come out of the proximal tubule, so the blood osmolarity is about 300. Okay, so we filtered, and it would be an osmolarity of 300. And then we moved all kinds of stuff in the proximal tubule, all these ions and glucose and blah, 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 and water followed. So as we come out of the proximal tubule, we will have an osmolarity of about 300, because water moved in equal proportion to the solutes that moved. Okay, so we're going to come out the end of the proximal tubule into the top of the descending limb of the loop of Henle with an osmolarity of about 300. Okay, cool, because the cortex has an osmolarity of about 300 as well. So the inside of the tube and the outside of the tube are equal in terms of their concentration. And then as we move, so fluid is flowing right through this tube. As we move fluid through this tube, the descending limb of the loop of Henle, we said, was permeable to water, impermeable to sodium. Okay? So as we move this fluid, osmolarity of 300, highly permeable to water, this tube is, and we move it through a concentration gradient, water will move to dilute. So water is going to move from the tube into that interstitial space. Okay, so water will move out because there's the drive. We set the drive up. It's concentrated on the outside, less concentrated on the inside. We let water move, water will move to dilute. Okay, so water is moving down its concentration gradient here. That's in the thin descending limb. The tube then takes a turn, so it spends, because it's taking a turn, it's spending more time at this level than it is at any other level, right? So we always equilibrate the inside and the outside at the bottom of the tube, because we spend more time here. So we will equilibrate. So water will move to dilute such that the inside of the tube and the outside of the tube become then the same osmolarity. So very concentrated on the inside of the tube now. We spend time at that bottom of the tube, so we equilibrate with our surroundings. So we take the turn, and then we head back up the ascending limb of the loop of Henle. Impermeable to water, permeable to sodium. So now it's hugely concentrated on the inside of this tube, and as we move that fluid back up through the concentration gradient, sodium will move down its concentration gradient. Okay? So we get sodium movement out at this portion as sodium moves down its concentration gradient. So we move sodium out, not water, we move sodium out, so then the inside of the tube looks like it's becoming more dilute, right? And we went from 1,400 milliosmoles to 900, but that's because we moved, so we're moving sodium out now, right? So it looks like we're becoming more dilute. And then we hit the thick ascending limb of the loop of Henle, where it's impermeable to both, except for those transporters. Okay, we have those special transporters now where we take out all kinds of sodium, chloride, and potassium that are not dictated by the osmolarity of the medullary space. Removing those ions are now dictated by how much time we spend by these transporters. Right? So we move out all kinds of sodium, chloride, and potassium and end up at the early distal tubule quite dilute with an osmolarity of 100 milliosmoles, having removed water, sodium, and then as the concentration gradient would dictate, and then sodium, chloride, and potassium based on transporter function. Okay? So we end up in that distal tubule. We now flow through that distal tubule and the collecting duct, and that distal tubule, late distal tubule and the collecting duct come down to that medullary space again. So they go down this concentration gradient again, right? But in the presence of low ADH, there's very little permeability to water. So not a whole lot changes as we move fluid down down the distal tubule to the collecting duct and down through the concentrated medullary space again. Okay? There's a little water movement depicted here only because there's a little ADH, right? We never have no ADH, we have a little ADH. So we will move a little bit of water as, again, we move down that concentration gradient. Okay, so this is the drive for water to move. And then the game afoot is, do we make this part of the tube permeable or not? Right? It's not permeable at the moment because we have low ADH. So we end up with very dilute urine. We can end up with very large volumes of dilute urine because essentially all the water in the system down to here has been trapped in that tube, and it's as good as gone because there's no way to get it back. Okay? So when we talk about large volumes of dilute urine, this could be massive. It could be up to 18 liters a day with low ADH. We must thank our ADH every day for hanging out. Okay? So what we've done then is we've taken a tube with special characteristics and we've laid it into an environment. And that environment was the medullary space. Concentrated, right? That was our drive to move. Okay? Okay, let's take a break and then we will put the vasa recta on top of that and see how we get it back. All right, ladies and gentlemen, let's get back to thinking about our medullary space. You've probably a fair number of you have probably experienced this whole low ADH, large volumes of dilute urine phenomenon, especially if you drink draft beer, and large volumes of it. So when you're drinking large volumes of anything, obviously you're volume loading and you're increasing your blood volume, and then you'll increase the amount filtered. Ethanol also inhibits ADH directly. So the number of times that you have to go to the washroom while you're drinking large volumes of, let's say, an ethanol boosted beverage, you will have been experiencing exactly what's going on this overhead. So the next time you're at the keg or the brass taps, think about your kidney. So we've got this tube, thin descending limb that turns a corner to the thin ascending limb. So critical to the function of this is that part of the tube is moving vertically through the concentration gradient, and part of the tube, as it turns, is moving horizontally through the concentration gradient. Okay? So anytime we move vertically through the concentration gradient and we have flow in that tube, there isn't enough time to equilibrate. Okay? So you won't necessarily have a concentration of 800 right here in the tube because the extracellular space is an osmolarity of 800, right? Because you've got flow in this tube and you just don't have enough time to equilibrate. Down at the bottom of the tube, though, as you turn and flow horizontally through that layer of the medullary space, because you're flowing horizontally through, you're spending more time there, and you can equilibrate. So critical is that at the bottom of every tube you're going to turn, you will equilibrate with the lowest or with the highest concentration in the medullary space. Okay, so you will equilibrate down here. So we've taken off water, and we've taken off sodium, and we've taken off some ions, and we've put them in that interstitial space. Right? Now, how do we get it back into the blood space? How do we reabsorb it back? Well, we've already talked about delta P and delta pi in terms of reabsorption. But we did have that special part of the peritubular capillary that did follow the loop of Henle down into the medullary space. We called it the vasa recta. Okay, so we're going to follow the vasa recta here for a moment. This vasa recta, okay, is sitting on top of this. I put it off to the side because life gets crazy when I try to draw it on top. Okay, so this is sitting on top of here. Okay, so the vasa recta, with no specific permeability characteristics like the loop of Henle had, okay, it's got no special permeability characteristics. It has blood in it, remember. Not filtrate, we're talking about the blood. This is an extension of the peritubular capillary bed, so it's a blood compartment. It has an osmolarity of 300, like blood does. Okay? As we move that, and it follows the loop of Henle down into that medullary space. As we move down the medullary space, it's much more concentrated on the outside than it is on the inside. So we'll tend to have sodium movement sodium will move down its concentration gradient because sodium is highly concentrated in the interstitial space and less concentrated in the blood space. So sodium will move down its concentration gradient. So we will tend to pick up all kinds of sodium, and then we will see a concentration of the blood as we move down. This vasa recta also goes vertically through the medullary space, not enough time to equilibrate. Turns a corner, spends some time horizontally through the medullary space, so it will equilibrate with the most concentrated part of the medullary space, and then begin to flow back up. So now we've got this blood space which is hugely concentrated. So water will move to dilute. But now we are flowing vertically through. Water is moving to dilute, and we don't quite have enough time to equilibrate. Okay? So as we come out of the vasa recta back into the peritubular capillary bed and into the venous system, we are a little more concentrated than we should be. We leave at an osmolarity of 320 milliosmoles because we didn't have enough time to dilute. Okay, we didn't have enough time to equilibrate with the 300. Right, we concentrated it and then didn't have enough time to equilibrate. So we leave a little more concentrated than we came in. Okay? Which is exactly what we need to have happen. The loop of Henle took off water based on the concentration gradient, and it took off, or sodium was removed based on the concentration gradient, and then extra was removed based on the transporters. So we had better to have a system that takes the sodium out of the interstitial space based on the concentration gradient, takes the water out of the interstitial space based on the gradient, and then a little bit more because of what the transporters put in. So this tube, the tubule, under normal circumstances, is moving water based on the medullary, based on the osmotic gradient, sodium based on the osmotic gradient, and then a little bit more based on transporters. So if we don't remove all that from the interstitial space, we are going to add and add and add until our kidneys blow up. Super bad day. Okay? So if we want this system to remain in equilibrium, we have to take off water based on the concentration gradient. We have to take off sodium based on the concentration gradient, and a little bit more. Okay? So the vasa recta does that by taking off sodium, or removing sodium from that interstitial space based on the concentration gradient, removing water from that interstitial space based on the concentration gradient, and then based on flow, vertical flow through the concentration gradient, remove a little bit more. Okay? So the vasa recta then has removed exactly what the loop of Henle put on. Okay, so the loop of Henle put on sodium, water, and a little bit more. The vasa recta took off sodium, water, and a little bit more. Okay? We've got to take off what we put on, or else we're going to build up down there. Okay? So we leave a little more concentrated than we normally would, but that's perfect. That's exactly what we need to do. Okay, so that is then how the movement out of the loop of Henle distal tube in the collecting duct is dependent on the osmotic gradient that exists in the medullary space. Okay, we need this osmotic gradient to drive. First drive water, then drive sodium. So another important piece that we have to think about in terms of this medullary space is that it is not just an anatomical gift. Obviously, if we didn't have this concentration, we wouldn't really be able to get any water back that we filtered. So it is a gift, that's for sure, but it's just not an anatomical gift, okay? The loop makes it, and the loop can take it away, okay? So I'm going to go through this discussion a little bit. At the end of the day, if you're kind of looking at me kind of going, Coral, what the hell are you talking about? I just need you to buy, at the end of this discussion, that the loop makes it and the loop takes it away. Okay, I'm going to give you a little peek into what they call the countercurrent theory. We could spend an entire course thinking about the countercurrent theory. We're going to try to whoop through the philosophy of it in about 5 minutes, okay? At the end of the day, what I want you to take away is the medullary space concentration is made by the loop and can be taken away by the loop, okay? You have to buy that in order to really understand how ADH works. So let's think about the physics of a loop. So sometimes people get this argument when we think about temperature first. So let's see if we can buy the argument when we think about temperature. Let's say I've got a loop, like my little loop of Henle, and I've got flow through it, okay? And let's say at the bottom of that loop, I were to change the characters. Let's say at the bottom of that loop, I am going to add some heat. This is never a discussion that you'll ever have to repeat or talk back to me like on a test or anything. I just really need you to try to really fundamentally understand it. Okay, so let's say I've got this loop and I'm adding heat to the bottom of it. Okay, so that would mean that as we flow through here, that we're coming in at a certain temperature, right? And then I add heat to this part, which means I'm going to increase my temperature down here, right? And then as I flow that fluid with the increased heat back up the tube, some of that heat will dissipate into the environment, right? So because some of that heat will now dissipate into the environment, we would expect to then see an increase in temperature in the environment based on that adding heat to the fluid in the tube, right? Does that make sense? Are we buying this piece? Okay, so if we were to increase temperature now, so as if we increase temperature here and then we dissipate heat into the environment, obviously the heat on the tube, what's on the inside of the tube will drop, and I don't know how far it'll drop, but it'll drop until the fluid goes out. So the key here is that we've just changed the environment beside the fluid coming in because it's a loop. Okay, so now the fluid coming in, which was its normal temperature, will be heated by the environment, right? And now the incoming fluid that's going by the heat source now actually has an increase in temperature already. All right, so now we've got this fluid flowing by the heat source, which already has an increase in temperature. So when we heat it, we're going to get a greater increase in temperature and then more dissipation to increase temperature, which will then affect the incoming fluid. So you can see now that how one side of the tube is affecting the other side of the tube because it is a loop. This wouldn't work if it was one long tube from one end to the other. This only works because we fold it up, we make it a loop, and the input and the output are now starting to affect each other, okay? So what you'll end up doing is if you let this run, is you will end up with high temperatures down here. And then as you move up, the temperature will get less and less and less. So we can create very quickly a temperature gradient. Highest temperature at the bottom, lowest at the top, based on the loop, okay? So, take that thinking and think about our little loop of Henle, okay? Same argument here. I've got a loop where I'm flowing through my fluid of an osmolarity of 300 and my interstitial space is an osmolarity of 300, okay? And then on that thick ascending limb, I put those little transporters. On the thick ascending limb, I put those little transporters and I take out some sodium and some potassium and some chloride. I take out some ions and I put them in that interstitial space right here. So the interstitial space becomes more concentrated. Now, as I flow that fluid past the more concentrated input, and I make this part, it's the thin descending limb, it's permeable to water, water will move to dilute. Okay? Water moves to dilute. That makes what's coming into the system, just about to flow by those transporters, more concentrated. Okay, so now I've got more concentrated fluid moving by those transporters. I move by the more concentrated fluid by those transporters. I take out stuff, okay, which now makes the interstitial space more concentrated. And now again, as I flow that incoming fluid and make it more, and the tubule is more permeable to water, I move water based on what the thick ascending limb did. Okay, so can you see how, in the same vein as the temperature example, that if we put those transporters as the thick ascending limb and concentrate the extracellular space, that extracellular space now is going to affect the concentration of the tube on the inside of our input side, and at the end of the day, we end up building a concentration gradient in that medullary space. Okay, so the tube made it, and the tube can take it away. Okay? To understand really how ADH works, ADH can make the tubule more permeable to water. That doesn't mean more fluid will move. Fluid will move just based on the concentration gradient. So just because we make the distal tubule in the collecting duct more permeable to water, who cares? It's still going down that same medullary space. So the trick then would be to change the concentration of the medullary space. So not only do we make it more permeable, we increase the drive. Okay, that's what ADH is going to do for us. So at the end of the day, whether we completely get this, or you're right on the edge of getting it, or you're looking at me going, "What? I just need you to buy." The tube makes the gradient, and the tube can take it away. Okay? So that's the only way we're really going to grasp how ADH works. Oh, and look what time it is. I'd love to tell you how ADH works, but we will have to wait until Thursday for that. Okay, have a good day, guys.